Picture this. A new girl stands frozen as cruel bullies corner her in the school courtyard, one of them gathering saliva to spit directly in her face. But what they don't know is that Emma Rodriguez has been perfecting her karate for 8 years, and her lightning-fast response will leave them sprawled on the concrete in seconds. This is a story of hidden strength erupting when pushed too far, and you absolutely need to see how it unfolds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the towering Douglas firs that surrounded Riverside, Oregon like protective sentinels, their emerald branches dripping with the previous night's rain. The air carried the rich scent of wet earth and pine needles, mixing with the distant aroma of coffee from the local roastery that had been serving the community for 3 generations. This was a town where everyone knew everyone, where family histories stretched back decades, and where newcomers were scrutinized with the intensity of scientists examining a rare specimen under a microscope. Emma Rodriguez pressed her forehead against the cool window of her mother's aging Honda Civic as they navigated the winding roads toward Riverside High School. The windshield wipers squeaked rhythmically against the glass, fighting a losing battle against the persistent Oregon drizzle that seemed to seep into every corner of this unfamiliar place. Back in sunny California, mornings meant clear skies and the warmth of familiar faces. Here, everything felt muted and gray, as if the world had been drained of its vibrancy overnight. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, dark brown eyes wide with apprehension. Her black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that her mother had helped her fix that morning. At 16, Emma had the kind of quiet beauty that might have made her popular in her old school, but here she was, just another face in an ocean of strangers. She wore a simple burgundy sweater and dark jeans, clothing chosen specifically to avoid drawing attention, though she suspected that being the new girl would make invisibility impossible regardless of her wardrobe choices. Rosa Rodriguez glanced at her daughter through the rearview mirror, her nurse's uniform already wrinkled from her overnight shift at Riverside General Hospital. The dark circles under her eyes spoke of exhaustion that went deeper than just one sleepless night. Moving across the country as a single mother had drained their savings and tested Rosa's resilience in ways she hadn't anticipated. The divorce from Emma's father had been final for 2 years now, but the financial and emotional aftermath still followed them like shadows they couldn't quite escape. "Mija, remember what we talked about?" Rosa said softly, her voice carrying the slight accent that became more pronounced when she was tired or emotional. "New beginnings are never easy, but they're chances to become who we're meant to be. Just give it time." Her fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel as she spoke, betraying her own anxiety about this fresh start that felt more like a desperate escape than an adventure. Emma nodded without enthusiasm, her stomach churning with the familiar cocktail of dread and hope that had become her constant companion since they'd packed their lives into boxes 3 weeks ago. She thought about the Dragon's Path karate dojo that they'd discovered just 2 days after arriving in town, the familiar smell of the training mats and the sound of focused breathing that had made her feel momentarily at home in this strange new place. Sensei Mike Chen had welcomed her with the kind of understanding that suggested he recognized something in her movements, something that spoke of years of dedicated training and discipline. But that part of her life would remain hidden, just as it had been in California during her final months there. The confident, powerful Emma, who could execute a perfect kata or deliver a devastating reverse punch, was someone she kept locked away, accessible only within the sacred space of the dojo. At school, she would be just another quiet teenager trying to navigate the complex social ecosystem that existed within every high school across America. The Honda pulled into the student parking lot of Riverside High School, a sprawling complex of brick buildings connected by covered walkways designed to protect students from the region's notorious rainfall. The architecture was typical Pacific Northwest practical, all clean lines and large windows that maximized the limited natural light during the darker months. Students moved between buildings like schools of fish, their colorful rain jackets and umbrellas, creating splashes of brightness against the muted backdrop of concrete and steel. Emma shouldered her worn backpack, the same one she'd carried through junior high in her first year and a half of high school in California. It contained the usual collection of textbooks and notebooks, but also a small photo of her and her mother taken during happier times, when Rosa's smile reached her eyes and Emma's laughter came easily. That photo served as a reminder of who they used to be, before life had forced them to reinvent themselves in a place where no one knew their story or understood the journey that had brought them here. Rosa reached over and squeezed Emma's hand, her calloused fingers warm despite the morning chill. "Remember, if you need anything, call me. I'll be sleeping until my shift tonight, but I'll always answer for you." Her voice carried the weight of promises made and kept, of sacrifices that went unspoken but never unnoticed. She had given up her social life, her extended family, and the familiar rhythms of life in California to provide Emma with what she hoped would be better opportunities in Oregon. As Emma walked toward the main entrance of Riverside High School, her sneakers splashing through shallow puddles that reflected the gray sky above, she felt the weight of countless eyes following her progress. Conversations paused as she passed groups of students, their curiosity palpable in the morning air. She kept her head down and her pace steady, already mentally preparing for the challenges that awaited her beyond those glass doors. In her old school, she had been part of the established order, comfortable in her place among friends who had known her since childhood. Here, she was an outsider looking in, vulnerable in ways that made her chest tight with anxiety she couldn't quite name. The glass doors of Riverside High School opened with a hydraulic hiss that seemed to exhale the collected breath of 1,000 teenagers into the misty Oregon morning. Emma stepped across the threshold and immediately felt the familiar assault on her senses that marked every American high school during the morning rush. The hallways stretched before her like arteries in some massive organism, their polished linoleum floors reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting that cast everything in an unforgiving glare. The walls were lined with blue metal lockers that bore the scars of countless opening and closing cycles, their surfaces decorated with the occasional motivational poster featuring generic landscapes and inspirational quotes that nobody actually read. The air carried a complex mixture of industrial disinfectant, teenage body spray applied with reckless abandon, and the lingering aroma of whatever breakfast items the cafeteria had served that morning. Somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic squeak of sneakers on polished floors created a soundtrack that would become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the coming months. Emma clutched her class schedule and locker combination, the paper already slightly damp from her nervous palms. The numbers and room codes might as well have been written in hieroglyphics, for all the sense they made to her disoriented mind. Students flowed around her like water around a stone, their conversations creating a constant buzz that rose and fell with the unpredictable patterns of adolescent social interaction. They moved with the confidence that came from knowing exactly where they belonged in this intricate ecosystem, their paths through the hallways as practiced and automatic as breathing. The social geography of Riverside High School revealed itself quickly to Emma's observant eyes. Near the main entrance, a cluster of students wearing Letterman jackets dominated the prime real estate adjacent to the trophy cases, their voices carrying the easy authority that came with athletic success and popular recognition. The football players were easily identifiable by their broad shoulders and the way other students automatically made space for them as they passed. Basketball players stood slightly apart, their height making them visible above the crowd like lighthouse beacons in a sea of teenage anonymity. Further down the main corridor, Emma noticed the distinct territories the different groups had claimed as their own. The drama students gathered near the auditorium entrance, their animated gestures and theatrical expressions marking them as clearly as if they wore costumes. Art students clustered around the bulletin board displaying this month's featured works, their clothing splattered with paint and their fingers stained with charcoal and ink. Academic achievers congregated near the library, their conversations peppered with references to college applications and scholarship deadlines that already felt impossibly distant to most of their classmates. The music students claimed the space outside the band room, their instrument cases creating temporary barriers that transformed the hallway into a makeshift green room. Emma could hear the faint sound of scales and warm-up exercises bleeding through the soundproofed doors, creating a melodic counterpoint to the chaos of voices and footsteps that filled the rest of the building. These students moved with the particular kind of focus that came from spending hours perfecting their craft, their fingers unconsciously practicing fingering patterns even when they weren't holding their instruments. But it was the group commanding the central courtyard that truly held Emma's attention as she found her way to the windows overlooking the outdoor space. Even through the rain-streaked glass, she could see the unmistakable markers of high school royalty. Jessica Parker stood at the center of a carefully arranged circle, her platinum blonde hair catching what little morning light managed to penetrate the Oregon clouds. Her posture radiated the kind of confidence that came from years of being at the top of the social food chain, her every gesture calculated to maintain her position as the undisputed queen of Riverside High School. The students surrounding Jessica moved in carefully choreographed patterns that spoke of established hierarchy and unspoken rules. Ashley Williams positioned herself at Jessica's right hand like a trusted lieutenant, her auburn hair styled in a way that complemented rather than competed with her leader's appearance. Her role seemed to be that of enforcer and interpreter, translating Jessica's wishes into actionable directives for the rest of the group. Brittany Davis and Morgan Thompson flanked the group like bookends, their positioning and body language suggesting they understood their roles as followers rather than leaders. The courtyard itself served as an unofficial amphitheater for the daily drama of teenage social interaction. Concrete benches arranged in geometric patterns provided seating that naturally segregated different groups while maintaining clear sight lines for observation and judgment. The administration had attempted to soften the harsh lines of the space with planters containing hardy Pacific Northwest vegetation, but the plants seemed to wilt under the weight of adolescent tension that permeated the area during peak social hours. Emma watched as other students navigated the courtyard with the careful precision of diplomats entering neutral territory. Some took circuitous routes that avoided direct contact with Jessica's group entirely, while others made strategic approaches that suggested complex social calculations were taking place behind seemingly casual. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Interactions. The unspoken rules governing this space were as rigid and unforgiving as any formal protocol, and violation of these invisible boundaries carried consequences that could reshape a student's entire high school experience. The building's architecture seemed designed to facilitate this kind of social surveillance and control. Wide corridors created natural gathering spaces where groups could form and dissolve without impeding traffic flow, while strategic placement of windows and open areas ensured that little happened in private. The designers had probably intended to create an environment that promoted openness and community, but the practical result was a panopticon, where every interaction was visible to multiple audiences and subject to immediate judgment and interpretation. Emma noticed how the morning light, filtered through the perpetual cloud cover that seemed to define Oregon's relationship with the sun, created a muted palette that made everything appear slightly unreal. The harsh brightness of California sunshine had revealed details with unforgiving clarity, but this diffused illumination seemed to soften edges and create shadows where secrets could hide. It was both more forgiving and more ominous than what she was accustomed to, suggesting possibilities for both refuge and ambush that kept her constantly alert. The administrative offices occupied the most prominent position near the main entrance, their glass walls providing school officials with clear sight lines into the hallways, while maintaining the appearance of accessibility and transparency. Emma could see assistant principals and counselors moving through their morning routines, their practiced efficiency, suggesting years of experience managing the complex dynamics that played out in these hallways every day. Their presence was both reassuring and intimidating, representing authority that could either protect or punish depending on circumstances beyond her current understanding. As Emma finally located her locker and began the process of memorizing her combination, she became aware of the subtle ways that information flowed through the building's social networks. Conversations paused as she passed, resuming with slightly different energy that suggested her presence had become a topic of discussion. Text messages were exchanged with the rapid-fire efficiency of a military communication system, spreading news of the new girl's arrival to corners of the building she hadn't even discovered yet. Emma's first period English class occupied a corner classroom on the second floor, its large windows offering a panoramic view of the forest that pressed against the school's eastern boundary. The rain had intensified since her arrival, transforming the glass into a constantly shifting canvas of water droplets that distorted the evergreen landscape beyond. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed with the persistent drone that would become the background soundtrack to her academic life at Riverside High School, their harsh illumination making everyone appear slightly pale and washed out. Mrs. Henderson, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, gestured for Emma to take the empty desk near the back corner. The choice felt simultaneously protective and isolating, offering refuge from the curious stares of her new classmates, while marking her as distinctly separate from the established social fabric of the room. As she settled into the plastic chair, Emma became acutely aware of the weight of 24 pairs of eyes assessing everything from her clothing choices to the way she arranged her notebooks on the scarred desktop. The desk itself told stories of previous occupants through the collection of scratches, pen marks, and faded stickers that decorated its surface. Someone had carved the initials RM+SB into the upper right corner with what appeared to be a compass point, while another student had used correction fluid to create a small constellation of white dots near the pencil groove. These tiny acts of rebellion and self-expression spoke to the universal teenage need to leave some mark of their existence in spaces designed to contain and control their developing identities. Emma pulled out her worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, the same edition she'd been reading in her California English class before the move disrupted her education. The familiar weight of the paperback in her hands provided a small anchor of continuity in this sea of unfamiliarity, though she suspected that Riverside High School's curriculum might approach the material from angles that would feel foreign and disorienting. She'd always excelled in English, finding refuge in the worlds that literature created and the way skilled authors could make language dance across pages with grace and power. Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the morning chatter as she called the class to attention, her tone carrying the authority that came from years of commanding teenage attention spans that naturally gravitated toward anything other than academic discussion. Class, I'd like you to welcome Emma Rodriguez, who's joining us from California. Emma, would you like to share something about yourself with your new classmates? The invitation hung in the air like a challenge that Emma felt completely unprepared to meet. In her old school, she would have deflected such attention with practiced ease, relying on friends to help navigate social expectations and fill uncomfortable silences. Here, she possessed no such support network, no allies who understood her personality well enough to rescue her from moments of exposure. She felt heat rise in her cheeks as silence stretched across the classroom, broken only by the persistent drumming of rain against the windows and the distant sound of lockers slamming in the hallway beyond. I'm from Sacramento, Emma managed, her voice emerging smaller than she'd intended. My mom got a job at the hospital here, so we moved a few weeks ago. The words felt inadequate, failing to capture the complexity of circumstances that had brought them to Oregon, or the mixture of hope and apprehension that colored every aspect of this transition. She could feel the weight of judgment in the subtle shifts of posture and expression among her classmates, their initial curiosity beginning to crystallize into more definitive assessments of where she might fit within their social ecosystem. A girl with curly red hair and freckles scattered across her nose turned in her seat, offering a smile that seemed genuine rather than performative. Sacramento's cool. I have a cousin who goes to UC Davis. Do you miss the sunshine? Her question carried none of the calculated assessment that Emma had learned to recognize in teenage social interactions, suggesting that not everyone at Riverside High School approached newcomers as potential threats or entertainment. Yeah, definitely, Emma replied, feeling some of the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. The rain here takes some getting used to. She gestured toward the window, where water continued its relentless descent, creating patterns that constantly formed and reformed, like some abstract art installation. Several students chuckled at her observation, and Emma felt a tiny spark of connection flicker to life in the otherwise alien environment of the classroom. But the moment of warmth was brief. From somewhere near the front of the room, Emma heard a stage whisper that was clearly intended to be audible to multiple listeners. Great, another California transplant come to tell us how much better everything was back home. The comment was followed by muffled laughter that felt like needles pricking at Emma's already fragile confidence. She couldn't identify the speaker without turning around and making her attention to the comment obvious, but the damage was already done. Mrs. Henderson either didn't hear the remark or chose to ignore it in favor of maintaining classroom momentum. She launched into a discussion of symbolism in Harper Lee's novel, asking students to identify examples of mockingbirds in the text and explain their significance to the story's broader themes. Emma raised her hand tentatively, drawing on knowledge from her previous school's analysis of the same passages, but found herself second-guessing everything she thought she understood about the material. When Mrs. Henderson called on her, Emma's response came out halting and uncertain, lacking the confidence she'd once brought to literary discussions. I think Tom Robinson represents a mockingbird because he's innocent but gets destroyed by society's prejudices. The analysis was solid, demonstrating her understanding of the metaphor's deeper implications, but her delivery suggested doubt rather than scholarly confidence. In her old classroom, this same observation would have sparked animated discussion and earned approving nods from classmates who respected her insights. Here, her words fell into a silence that felt more evaluative than contemplative. She noticed several students exchanging glances that seemed to communicate something beyond a simple academic disagreement, their expressions suggesting that her contribution had been measured against standards she didn't yet understand. The girl with red hair nodded encouragingly, but Emma sensed that support from that quarter might actually complicate her social position rather than strengthen it. During the transition between first and second periods, Emma navigated the hallways with the awkward uncertainty that marked all newcomers to established social environments. Students moved around her with fluid efficiency, their paths through the corridors as choreographed and automatic as any dance performance. She found herself constantly stepping aside to avoid collisions, apologizing for disruptions she hadn't caused, and generally occupying space in ways that felt intrusive and uncomfortable. Her locker, number 247, was located in a section of the building that seemed to serve as neutral territory between various social factions. She could observe different groups maintaining their respective territories while avoiding direct confrontation, their movements suggesting complex negotiations that took place below the threshold of adult awareness. The combination lock fought her for several attempts before finally surrendering with a metallic click that sounded louder than it should have in the bustling hallway environment. As Emma organized her textbooks and tried to memorize which materials she'd need for her next class, she became aware of a conversation taking place at the lockers directly across from hers. Two girls were discussing weekend plans with the kind of animated enthusiasm that suggested deep friendship and shared history. Their easy familiarity with each other and with the rhythms of life at Riverside High School highlighted Emma's own isolation in ways that felt almost physical. "Did you see the new girl in Henderson's class?" one of them asked, her voice carrying easily across the narrow space between their lockers. "She seems nice enough, I guess, but you know how Jessica feels about California girls. Remember what happened to that exchange student last year?" The comment was followed by knowing laughter that suggested shared knowledge of events that remained mysterious to Emma, but clearly carried significance within the school's social memory. The afternoon shift at Riverside General Hospital demanded everything Rosa Rodriguez had to give, leaving her physically and emotionally drained by the time she returned to their modest two-bedroom apartment each evening. The complex where they now lived bore little resemblance to the sunny Californian neighborhood Emma had called home for most of her life, where palm trees lined wide streets and Spanish tile roofs created a warm, welcoming aesthetic that matched the climate. Here in Oregon, the apartment buildings were constructed with Pacific Northwest practicality in mind, their cedar siding and large windows designed to maximize natural light during the region's notoriously gray months. Emma often found herself studying her mother's face during their quiet dinner conversations, noting the new lines around Rosa's eyes that spoke of stress and exhaustion that went deeper than simple fatigue. The divorce from Emma's father had been finalized 18 months ago, but the emotional and financial aftermath continued to shape every decision their small family made. Rosa had taken the nursing position in Oregon not because it represented her dream career move, but because it offered health insurance, a signing bonus that covered their moving expenses, and the chance to escape the complicated web of shared custody arrangements and bitter arguments that had defined their final year in California. The apartment itself reflected their reduced circumstances with painful clarity. Where their California home had featured a spacious kitchen with granite countertops and custom cabinetry, their current living space offered basic appliances and laminate surfaces that showed every fingerprint and water stain. Emma's bedroom was barely large enough to accommodate her twin bed and a small desk, forcing her to store most of her belongings in plastic tubs that remained stacked against one wall like a constant reminder of their temporary status in this place. But it was the absence of familiar sounds and rhythms that struck Emma most profoundly during their first weeks in Oregon. Gone were the voices of neighbors she'd known since childhood, replaced by the muffled conversations of strangers whose lives intersected with theirs only through shared walls and occasional encounters in the parking lot. The morning routine that had once included her mother's laughter and easy conversation now unfolded in careful quiet, both women conscious of the thin walls that offered little privacy from their new neighbors. Rosa worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital, rotating between days and nights in patterns that made normal family dinners and conversation challenging to maintain. When she was home during Emma's waking hours, exhaustion often claimed her attention in ways that left little energy for the kind of deep mother-daughter talks they'd once shared regularly. Emma understood the sacrifice her mother was making to rebuild their lives, but the understanding didn't ease the loneliness that crept into the quiet spaces between their increasingly brief interactions. The Dragon's Path Karate Dojo occupied a corner unit in a strip mall located 15 minutes from their apartment complex, sandwiched between a Thai restaurant and a used bookstore that specialized in science fiction novels. Emma had discovered it 3 days after their arrival in Oregon, while exploring the area on foot during one of her mother's sleeping periods between hospital shifts. The familiar smell of training mats and the sound of focused breathing had drawn her to the large windows like a moth to flame, awakening a hunger for connection she hadn't realized had been growing inside her chest. Sensei Mike Chen had been teaching traditional karate for 23 years, his small dojo serving as a sanctuary for students ranging from energetic 6-year-olds learning basic techniques to serious adult practitioners pursuing advanced black belt rankings. His own journey in martial arts had begun during his teenage years in San Francisco, where bullying and cultural isolation had driven him to seek confidence through disciplined training. Now in his 50s, his movements still carried the fluid precision that marked true mastery, though silver threads had begun to weave through his black hair and laugh lines mapped the corners of his eyes. Emma had begun training when she was 8 years old, initially as a way to channel the restless energy that made sitting still during school hours a constant struggle. Her first sensei in California had recognized something special in her approach to the art, noting how quickly she absorbed new techniques and the natural grace with which she executed even complex combinations. Over 8 years of dedicated practice, she had progressed through the belt rankings with steady determination, earning her black belt just 6 months before their move to Oregon disrupted her training routine. But Emma's relationship with karate had evolved far beyond simple physical exercise or even self-defense preparation. The dojo had become her refuge during the worst periods of her parents' deteriorating marriage, when raised voices and slammed doors made their house feel like a battlefield rather than a home. The meditation aspects of her training had taught her to find calm centers within emotional storms, while the philosophical elements helped her understand concepts of respect, perseverance, and inner strength that textbooks couldn't adequately convey. The decision to keep her martial arts background secret from her new classmates had been conscious and strategic. In her old school, her karate achievements had earned respect and admiration from peers who understood the dedication required to reach black belt level. But arriving as the new girl in an established social ecosystem, Emma recognized that revealing her fighting skills might be misinterpreted as aggression or showing off. Better to remain invisible and assess the social landscape before deciding how much of herself to reveal to her new environment. Sensei Chen had welcomed Emma to Dragon's Path with a kind of understanding that suggested he recognized the displacement and uncertainty she carried like invisible weights. During her first class, he had observed her forms and sparring techniques with the analytical eye of someone who could read personal history in the way students move their bodies through space. Her California training had been excellent, but he detected the subtle signs of someone who had been using martial arts as emotional armor, rather than simply physical development. The other students at Dragon's Path represented a cross-section of Riverside's community that Emma found refreshingly different from the rigid social hierarchies of high school. A middle-aged accountant trained alongside a retired teacher and a college student home for summer break, their shared commitment to improvement creating bonds that transcended age and background differences. Emma particularly appreciated how the dojo's culture emphasized internal growth alongside physical technique, with Sensei Chen regularly incorporating discussions of character development and ethical responsibility into their training sessions. Rosa had initially worried about the monthly fee for Emma's karate classes, given their drastically reduced household budget and the uncertainty surrounding their financial future in Oregon. But seeing the way Emma's posture straightened and her confidence returned during the hours immediately following training sessions, convinced Rosa that this expense was essential rather than optional. The dojo represented continuity in Emma's life, a bridge between who she had been in California and who she might become in this new place. The evening training sessions also provided Emma with a legitimate reason to be away from the apartment during Rosa's sleeping hours, reducing the pressure on both of them to maintain conversation and connection when exhaustion made meaningful interaction challenging. Emma would return from the dojo physically tired but emotionally restored, her muscles pleasantly fatigued, and her mind cleared of the daily anxieties that accumulated during school hours like dust settling on furniture. But the growing strength and skill she developed during these training sessions remained carefully hidden from her high school life, stored away like a secret weapon she hoped never to need. Emma understood instinctively that revealing her capabilities too early might invite challenges or confrontations she wasn't prepared to handle, while maintaining her quiet, unassuming public persona offered protection through perceived harmlessness. Jessica Parker's reign over Riverside High School had begun 3 years earlier when she transferred from a private academy in Portland, arriving with the kind of polished confidence that immediately marked her as someone destined for social supremacy. Her family's relocation to the area had been driven by her father's promotion to regional manager of a major insurance company, bringing with them the financial, resources and social connections that opened doors others couldn't even see. From her first day at Riverside High, Jessica had surveyed the existing social landscape with the calculating eye of a general planning a conquest, identifying power structures and potential allies with the kind of strategic thinking that would have impressed military strategists. The transformation of Jessica from a new student to undisputed queen of the school had been neither accidental nor effortless. She had studied the existing hierarchy with methodical precision, noting how influence flowed through different groups and identifying the key individuals whose allegiance would be necessary for her ascension. Unlike many teenagers who stumbled into popularity through accidents of birth or circumstance, Jessica had engineered her rise with the deliberate calculation of someone who understood that high school social dynamics were simply practice for the adult world's more sophisticated power games. Her physical appearance had been carefully cultivated to project an image of effortless superiority that required significant time and financial investment to maintain. The platinum blonde hair that caught light so dramatically in school hallways was the result of monthly salon appointments that cost more than many families spent on groceries. Her wardrobe consisted entirely of name-brand pieces selected not just for their aesthetic appeal but for their ability to communicate wealth and status to observant classmates. Even her seemingly casual makeup routine involved products whose prices would have shocked students from more modest backgrounds, applied with techniques learned from online tutorials and professional consultations. But Jessica's true power lay not in her appearance, but in her sophisticated understanding of teenage psychology and social manipulation. She had recognized early that maintaining dominance required more than simply looking the part or having access to financial resources. True influence came from understanding what motivated her peers, what insecurities drove their behavior, and how those vulnerabilities could be exploited to maintain her position at the apex of the social pyramid. She had spent countless hours studying the personal histories and family situations of her classmates, gathering information that could be deployed strategically when circumstances required demonstrations of her power. The selection of her inner circle had been as deliberate as every other aspect of Jessica's social engineering project. Ashley Williams had been recruited not just for her intelligence and organizational skills, but for her family's connections within the community and her own ambitions for popularity that made her a reliable ally. Brittany Davis brought artistic talents and creative thinking that proved useful for devising new forms of social warfare, while Morgan Thompson's athletic abilities and connections to the sports programs provided access to influence networks that might otherwise have remained beyond Jessica's reach. Each member of Jessica's crew understood their role within the hierarchy with crystalline clarity, their positions maintained through a combination of rewarded loyalty and the constant threat of social exile. Jessica had demonstrated repeatedly that crossing her resulted in immediate and devastating consequences, while faithful service brought access to parties, social events, and the kind of reflected popularity that made high school life significantly more comfortable. The system she had created was both efficient and self-perpetuating, with each member motivated to maintain their position by enforcing the rules and standards that kept Jessica in power. The methods Jessica employed to maintain control over the school's social ecosystem were as varied as they were effective. She had mastered the art of social media manipulation, understanding how to craft posts and images that projected the lifestyle other students envied while simultaneously documenting the exclusion of those who had fallen from favor. Her Instagram account served as both aspirational content and subtle threat, showing elaborate parties and expensive purchases while carefully excluding anyone who had challenged her authority. The psychological impact of seeing themselves cropped out of group photos or absent from event coverage was devastating to teenagers whose social validation depended heavily on visible inclusion in popular activities. Jessica's influence extended far beyond social media into the practical realities of daily school life. She had cultivated relationships with key figures throughout the school's social infrastructure, from student government officers to club leaders, to athletes whose popularity gave them independent power bases. Through careful application of charm, strategic alliances, and occasional demonstrations of her ability to make life difficult for those who opposed her, she had created a network of allies and intimidated neutrals that made resistance to her will both difficult and costly. The systematic nature of Jessica's approach to social control became most apparent in how she dealt with potential threats to her authority. New students, particularly attractive girls who might challenge her position as the school's undisputed queen, received immediate attention designed to establish dominance and prevent the development of independent power bases. Jessica had perfected a pattern of engagement that began with superficial friendliness designed to gather intelligence about potential rivals, followed by increasingly subtle forms of undermining that destroyed confidence and social connections before victims fully understood what was happening to them. The targeting process Jessica employed demonstrated remarkable sophistication in its understanding of adolescent vulnerabilities. She recognized that direct confrontation often backfired by generating sympathy for victims and potentially creating martyrs who could rally opposition to her rule. Instead, she preferred campaigns of social isolation and psychological pressure that gradually eroded her target's confidence and support networks until they were too weakened to mount effective resistance. The beauty of this approach was that it appeared almost natural to outside observers, as if unpopular students were simply failing to fit in, rather than being systematically excluded. Ashley Williams served as Jessica's primary lieutenant in these campaigns, her role involving both strategic planning and tactical execution of social warfare operations. Ashley possessed a natural talent for identifying the specific insecurities and pressure points that would be most effective against particular targets, while her academic achievement and apparent respectability provided cover for activities that might otherwise have attracted adult intervention. Teachers and administrators saw Ashley as a model student whose involvement in any conflict suggested that problems lay with other parties rather than with Jessica's crew. The intelligence-gathering operations that supported Jessica's social control efforts would have impressed professional organizations with their thoroughness and sophistication. Information about family financial difficulties, academic struggles, romantic disappointments, and personal embarrassments was collected through a network of informants who often didn't realize they were serving Jessica's purposes. Casual conversations, social media monitoring, and observation of behavioral changes provided streams of data that were analyzed and cataloged for potential future use against anyone who might threaten the established order. Brittany Davis contributed to the organization through her artistic skills and creative imagination, devising new methods of humiliation and social pressure that kept Jessica's campaigns fresh and unpredictable. Her talents extended to creating convincing fake social media profiles, designing embarrassing memes and images, and developing elaborate pranks that appeared to spring from multiple sources rather than a coordinated campaign. Brittany's contributions were particularly valuable because they created plausible deniability for Jessica's direct involvement, while maximizing the psychological impact on targeted individuals. Morgan Thompson's role within the hierarchy focused on maintaining connections with the athletic programs and enforcing Jessica's will through more direct forms of intimidation when subtle approaches proved insufficient. Her physical presence and connections to other athletes provided muscle for operations that required face-to-face confrontation, while her participation in multiple sports gave her access to information and influence networks throughout the school. Morgan understood that her position in Jessica's inner circle depended on her willingness to handle the more confrontational aspects of maintaining social control. The financial resources available to Jessica's organization provided significant advantages in their campaigns against targeted individuals. The crew had access to technology, transportation, and entertainment options that allowed them to both reward allies and demonstrate the benefits of remaining in their good graces. Elaborate parties at Jessica's family's spacious home served dual purposes as recruitment tools for potential new allies and demonstrations of what excluded individuals were missing. The psychological impact of seeing social media coverage of events they hadn't been invited to attend was often more devastating than direct confrontation would have been. Jessica's understanding of adult psychology proved as sophisticated as her manipulation of peer relationships, allowing her crew to operate with minimal interference from teachers and administrators who might otherwise have intervened in their activities. She had learned to present herself to authority figures as a responsible student leader whose involvement in any conflict suggested that other parties were the source of problems. Her academic performance, while not exceptional, was sufficient to maintain the appearance of a well-rounded student whose social prominence reflected positive leadership qualities rather than manipulative behavior. The timing of Jessica's campaigns against potential rivals demonstrated careful consideration of both practical and psychological factors. New students typically face their initial targeting during the vulnerable period, when they were still learning social dynamics and hadn't yet established support networks that might have provided protection. The approach was designed to prevent the formation of independent power bases that could challenge Jessica's authority, while the targets were still isolated and uncertain about their place in the school's social ecosystem. Emma Rodriguez had attracted Jessica's attention from her first day at Riverside High School, not because she posed any immediate threat, but because her background and circumstances fit the profile of students who had previously challenged the established social order. California transplants had historically proven problematic for Jessica's organization, often arriving with different social expectations and confidence levels that made them resistant to the intimidation tactics that worked effectively on students who had grown up understanding the local social dynamics. The intelligence-gathering phase of Jessica's campaign against Emma had begun immediately, with crew members tasked with learning everything possible about the new girl's background, family situation, interests, and potential vulnerabilities. Within days, they had assembled a comprehensive profile that included information about Emma's mother's work schedule, their reduced financial circumstances, the absence of Emma's father, and the family's recent relocation under circumstances that suggested economic rather than professional advancement. Ashley Williams had taken particular interest in Emma's academic performance and classroom behavior, noting the way she participated in discussions and the quality of her work in shared classes. This information was valuable because it helped predict how Emma might respond to different types of pressure and whether she possessed the intellectual resources to mount effective countermeasures against social manipulation. Ashley's observations suggested that Emma was intelligent and observant, qualities that could make her either a valuable ally or a dangerous opponent, depending on how she was approached. Brittany Davis had focused her attention on Emma's appearance and social presentation, analyzing clothing choices, grooming habits, and body language for signs of confidence or insecurity that could be exploited in future operations. Her artistic eye had detected the careful way Emma dressed to avoid attention, and the subtle signs of economic constraints that influenced her wardrobe choices. This information would prove crucial in designing humiliation tactics that would be most effective against someone clearly sensitive about her family's reduced circumstances. Morgan Thompson's assignment had involved observing Emma's physical capabilities and behavioral patterns during gym class and other activities that might reveal useful information about her background and potential responses to physical intimidation. Morgan's athletic experience gave her expertise in reading body language and movement patterns that might indicate previous training or natural abilities that could complicate future confrontations. Her initial observations had noted nothing particularly concerning about Emma's physical presence or confidence levels. The decision to target Emma had been made during one of Jessica's regular strategy sessions with her inner circle, conducted in the privacy of Jessica's bedroom where they could speak freely about their plans without concern for potential eavesdroppers. These meetings served multiple purposes within the organization's structure, both as operational planning sessions and as bonding experiences that reinforced the crew's sense of shared purpose and mutual dependence. Jessica had learned that including her lieutenants in strategic decision-making increased their investment in successful outcomes, while providing valuable input from different perspectives. The initial approach to Emma had followed Jessica's standard pattern of superficial friendliness, designed to gather intelligence while establishing her crew as the arbiters of social acceptance within the school. Ashley Williams had been assigned to make first contact, her academic credentials and apparent respectability making her an ideal scout for these reconnaissance missions. The goal was to learn as much as possible about Emma's personality, interests, and vulnerabilities, while creating the impression that acceptance into the popular crowd was a possibility if Emma proved worthy of consideration. Ashley's initial conversations with Emma had yielded valuable intelligence about the family's circumstances and Emma's own uncertainty about her place in the school's social structure. Emma's obvious desire to fit in and avoid conflict had been noted as potential weaknesses that could be exploited if more aggressive action became necessary. The reconnaissance phase had also revealed Emma's tendency to avoid confrontation and her apparent lack of a strong support network within the school. Factors that suggested she would be an ideal target for the kind of systematic social pressure that had proven effective against previous victims. The escalation from intelligence gathering to active targeting had been triggered by Jessica's assessment that Emma possessed qualities that could eventually challenge the established social order if allowed to develop unchecked. Emma's intelligence, her exotic California background, and her potential for developing independent popularity made her a strategic threat that needed to be neutralized before she could establish herself as an alternative to Jessica's leadership. The decision to move against Emma had been made proactively rather than in response to any actual challenge, reflecting Jessica's sophisticated understanding of long-term strategic thinking. The first direct action against Emma had been carefully designed to test her responses to social pressure, while establishing Jessica's crew as the dominant force in her high school experience. The approach had been subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, while sending clear messages about the consequences of failing to acknowledge the existing social hierarchy. Jessica understood that the most effective intimidation campaigns began with relatively minor incidents that escalated gradually, allowing targets to rationalize early encounters while building toward more serious confrontations that would be difficult to ignore or dismiss. The selection of the courtyard as the setting for Emma's initiation into Riverside High School's social realities had been strategic rather than coincidental. The outdoor space served as the school's primary theater for social drama, its open design ensuring that any significant interactions would be witnessed by multiple audiences, whose reactions would amplify the psychological impact of whatever took place. Jessica had learned that public humiliation was far more effective than private confrontation, because it created social proof of her power, while discouraging intervention from potential allies who might fear becoming targets themselves. The timing of the confrontation had been chosen to maximize both audience size and psychological impact on the target. The lunch period represented peak social activity, when the greatest number of students would be present to witness Jessica's demonstration of power over the new girl. The weather conditions, with their typical Oregon drizzle creating an appropriately gloomy atmosphere, added to the intimidating environment while providing practical advantages for Jessica's crew in terms of controlling the physical space and limiting Emma's options for escape or evasion. Jessica's personal preparation for the confrontation had included careful consideration of her appearance, body language, and verbal strategies that would most effectively communicate her dominance, while maintaining the appearance of casual social interaction to any adult observers who might witness the encounter. Her crew had been briefed on their individual roles in the operation, with each member assigned specific responsibilities for controlling different aspects of the situation and ensuring that Emma understood the futility of resistance to their collective will. The psychological foundation of Jessica's approach to social control rested on her understanding that most teenagers desperately craved acceptance and would endure significant abuse rather than face complete social isolation. She had observed that victims of her campaigns often blamed themselves for their treatment, assuming that their exclusion resulted from personal failings rather than systematic targeting by a hostile organization. This tendency to internalize blame made recovery from social attacks more difficult, while reducing the likelihood that victims would seek help from adults who might intervene on their behalf. Ashley Williams had spent considerable time studying the specific vulnerabilities that made Emma an ideal target for their organization's attention. Emma's recent arrival at the school meant she lacked established relationships that might provide protection or support during difficult periods. Her family's reduced financial circumstances made her sensitive to displays of wealth and status that Jessica's crew could weaponize for maximum psychological impact. Her obvious intelligence made her aware of the social dynamics working against her, while her lack of local connections prevented her from developing effective countermeasures. Brittany Davis had contributed to the planning process by developing creative approaches to psychological pressure that would be particularly effective against someone with Emma's background and personality type. Her artistic sensibilities had identified the symbolic value of targeting Emma's clothing and appearance, recognizing that attacks on personal presentation would resonate deeply with someone already conscious of her family's economic constraints. Brittany's contributions to the campaign would focus on creating visual and symbolic humiliations that communicated Jessica's power while reinforcing Emma's outsider status. Morgan Thompson's role in the upcoming confrontation would involve providing physical presence and intimidation that would discourage any thoughts Emma might have about resistance or retaliation. Morgan's athletic build and confident demeanor had proven effective in previous campaigns at communicating the futility of physical resistance, while her participation in school sports provided her with social protection that made adult intervention unlikely. Her assignment was to ensure that Emma understood the physical dimensions of the power imbalance she faced while maintaining plausible deniability about any actual threats. The broader context of Jessica's campaign against Emma reflected her organization's ongoing efforts to maintain control over the school's social environment through periodic demonstrations of power that reinforced existing hierarchies while discouraging challenges from potential rivals. These campaigns served educational purposes for the broader student body, showing what happened to individuals who failed to acknowledge Jessica's authority, while providing entertainment value that increased the crew's popularity among students who enjoyed witnessing the downfall of others. The systematic nature of Jessica's approach to social control had been refined through years of experience with different types of targets and situations, creating a sophisticated methodology that maximized effectiveness while minimizing risks of adult intervention or organized resistance. Each campaign provided learning opportunities that improved future operations, with successful tactics being incorporated into standard procedures while failed approaches were analyzed and modified to prevent similar problems in subsequent operations. The intelligence network that supported Jessica's activities extended throughout the school's social infrastructure, providing early warning of potential threats and ongoing monitoring of targeted individuals' responses to pressure campaigns. This network included both willing collaborators who actively supported Jessica's agenda and intimidated neutrals who provided information to avoid becoming targets themselves. The system was both efficient and self-protecting, with multiple redundancies that ensured continued operation even if individual sources were compromised or removed. The financial resources available to Jessica's organization provided significant operational advantages that distinguished their campaigns from typical teenage social conflicts. Access to technology, transportation, and entertainment options allowed them to conduct sophisticated operations while providing rewards for allies and demonstrations of what excluded individuals were missing. The crew's ability to host elaborate social events and purchase expensive gifts created powerful incentives for cooperation, while making the costs of opposition appear particularly stark to potential targets. Jessica's understanding of adult psychology and institutional dynamics had proven crucial to her organization's success in avoiding serious intervention from teachers and administrators who might otherwise have disrupted their activities. She had learned to present conflicts in ways that made her crew appear to be victims or innocent bystanders rather than aggressors, while her academic performance and extracurricular involvement provided credibility with authority figures who were naturally inclined to support students who appeared to be positive contributors to the school community. The timing and location of Jessica's campaigns were always carefully chosen to maximize psychological impact, while minimizing risks of detection or intervention by adults who might interfere with their operations. The crew had developed expertise in identifying moments and places where they could operate with relative freedom, while ensuring that their activities would be witnessed by appropriate audiences whose reactions would amplify the intended effects on targeted individuals. The graduation of previous senior leaders had created opportunities for Jessica to consolidate her control over the school's social environment, while eliminating potential rivals who might have challenged her authority. Her systematic approach to leadership succession had ensured that departing seniors were replaced by carefully selected underclassmen whose loyalty had been tested and confirmed through smaller operations. This continuity planning had prevented the kind of power vacuums that might have created opportunities for alternative leadership to emerge. The psychological profiles that Jessica's organization developed for each targeted individual reflected sophisticated understanding of adolescent development and the specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited for maximum effect. These profiles included information about family dynamics, academic performance, social aspirations, and personal insecurities that could be weaponized in carefully designed campaigns of pressure and humiliation. The thoroughness of this intelligence gathering often surprised targets who discovered that their most private struggles had somehow become weapons in someone else's arsenal. Emma Rodriguez represented a particularly interesting challenge for Jessica's organization because her background combined several factors that had historically proven problematic for their operations. California transplants often arrived with social expectations and confidence levels that made them resistant to intimidation tactics that worked effectively on local students who had grown up understanding the established social dynamics. Additionally, Emma's obvious intelligence and academic capabilities suggested she might be able to develop countermeasures against psychological pressure campaigns if given sufficient time and motivation. The decision to move against Emma proactively, rather than waiting for her to establish herself within the school's social structure, reflected Jessica's strategic thinking and her understanding that prevention was more efficient than remediation when dealing with potential threats to her authority. By targeting Emma before she could develop strong relationships or gain confidence in her new environment, Jessica hoped to establish dominance quickly, while the new girl was still vulnerable and isolated. The crew's preparation for their campaign against Emma had included detailed reconnaissance of her daily routines, social interactions, and behavioral patterns that might provide insights into the most effective approaches for psychological manipulation. This information had been gathered through direct observation, social media monitoring, and casual conversations with classmates who had interacted with Emma during her first weeks at Riverside High School. The intelligence picture that emerged had suggested several potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited in a coordinated campaign of social pressure. Ashley Williams had taken particular interest in Emma's academic performance and classroom participation, noting that the new girl appeared intelligent and engaged, but also somewhat uncertain about her place in the school's social dynamics. This combination of capability and insecurity suggested that Emma might be susceptible to campaigns that undermined her confidence while highlighting her outsider status. Ashley's recommendations had focused on tactics that would exploit Emma's desire to fit in, while demonstrating the futility of seeking acceptance through academic achievement alone. Brittany Davis had analyzed Emma's appearance and presentation for signs of economic constraint or social insecurity that could be weaponized in future operations. Her artistic eye had detected the careful way Emma selected clothing that would avoid drawing attention while working within obvious budget limitations. This information had suggested approaches that would highlight Emma's economic vulnerability while demonstrating the material advantages that came with acceptance into Jessica's social circle. Morgan Thompson's observations of Emma's physical presence and behavioral patterns had focused on identifying potential responses to intimidation or confrontation that might complicate future operations. Her athletic experience had given her expertise in reading body language and movement patterns that might indicate previous training or natural abilities that could pose challenges for the crew's standard operating procedures. Morgan's initial assessments had suggested that Emma posed no obvious physical threat to their organization's activities. The strategic planning sessions that had preceded the decision to target Emma had taken place in the privacy of Jessica's bedroom, where the crew could discuss their intentions without concern for potential eavesdroppers or interference from parents or siblings who might disapprove of their activities. These meetings served multiple purposes within the organization's structure, functioning as both operational planning sessions and bonding experiences that reinforced the crew's sense of shared purpose and mutual dependence on Jessica's leadership. Jessica's personal motivation for targeting Emma extended beyond simple strategic considerations to include elements of genuine concern about potential threats to her carefully constructed position within the school's social hierarchy. Emma's combination of intelligence, attractiveness, and exotic California background represented exactly the kind of challenge that had historically proven most dangerous to established social leaders. Jessica's decision to move against Emma reflected both calculated risk assessment and emotional responses to perceived threats that she might not have fully acknowledged even to herself. The broader context of Jessica's campaign against Emma included consideration of how this operation would affect her organization's reputation and effectiveness in future conflicts with other potential rivals. Success in neutralizing Emma would demonstrate the crew's continued ability to maintain social control while serving as a warning to other students who might be considering challenges to the established order. Failure, conversely, could encourage resistance from other quarters while potentially undermining the fear-based compliance that formed the foundation of Jessica's power. The systematic approach that Jessica's organization had developed for conducting social warfare campaigns reflected years of experience with different types of targets and situations, creating a sophisticated methodology that maximized effectiveness while minimizing risks of adult intervention or organized resistance. Each operation provided learning opportunities that improved future campaigns, with successful tactics being incorporated into standard procedures, while failed approaches were analyzed and modified to prevent similar problems in subsequent operations. The intelligence-gathering phase of the campaign against Emma had revealed several potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited through carefully designed psychological pressure operations. Emma's obvious desire to fit in made her susceptible to campaigns that promised acceptance while delivering humiliation. Her family's reduced financial circumstances provided multiple avenues for attacks that would highlight her economic vulnerability while demonstrating the material advantages that came with membership in Jessica's social circle. The crew's analysis of Emma's personality and behavioral patterns had suggested that she would likely respond to pressure by withdrawing and attempting to avoid confrontation rather than fighting back or seeking help from adults. This tendency toward avoidance made her an ideal target for the kind of systematic harassment that gradually escalated while maintaining plausible deniability about the organized nature of the campaign. Jessica's experience had taught her that victims who blamed themselves for their treatment were far less likely to seek help or organize resistance. The selection of tactics for use against Emma had been influenced by the crew's assessment of what approaches would be most effective given her specific vulnerabilities and personality type. The plan that emerged from their strategic planning sessions combined elements of social isolation, economic humiliation, and public embarrassment designed to destroy Emma's confidence while demonstrating Jessica's power to the broader student body. The campaign would begin with relatively subtle pressure that could be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding, then escalate gradually toward more obvious confrontations that would force Emma to acknowledge her powerlessness. The timing of the initial confrontation with Emma had been chosen to coincide with optimal conditions for maximum psychological impact and minimal risk of adult intervention. The lunch period provided the largest possible audience of student witnesses whose reactions would amplify the intended effects, while their presence would discourage any thoughts Emma might have about physical resistance. The outdoor courtyard setting offered Jessica's crew tactical advantages in terms of controlling the physical space while providing natural barriers that would limit Emma's options for escape or evasion. Jessica's personal preparation for the confrontation had included careful consideration of her appearance, demeanor, and verbal strategies that would most effectively communicate her dominance while maintaining the appearance of casual social interaction to any authority figures who might observe the encounter. Her crew had been briefed on their individual roles in the operation, with each member assigned specific responsibilities for ensuring that Emma understood the futility of resistance to their collective will. The psychological foundation of Jessica's approach to social control rested on her sophisticated understanding of adolescent insecurities and the desperate need for acceptance that characterized most teenagers' emotional lives. She had observed that victims of her campaigns often blamed themselves for their treatment, assuming that exclusion resulted from personal failings rather than systematic targeting by a hostile organization. This tendency to internalize blame made recovery from social attacks more difficult, while reducing the likelihood that victims would seek help from adults who might intervene on their behalf. As the lunch period began and students filtered into the courtyard through the various entrances that connected the outdoor space to the school's interior corridors, Jessica Parker stood at the center of her carefully chosen territory, her platinum blonde hair catching what little sunlight managed to penetrate the persistent Oregon cloud cover. Her posture radiated the kind of effortless confidence that came from years of social dominance, every gesture calculated to maintain her position as the undisputed center of attention in any environment she chose to occupy. Today's target had been selected weeks earlier, and the campaign that was about to unfold represented the culmination of careful planning and strategic thinking that would have impressed military tacticians with its thoroughness and attention to detail. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.